Fellow Social Democrats Conference Chairman, in the last few conferences I've tried to set a course which is clear, distinct, and above all true to our enduring values. No point in doing this unless we are. So I've talked about democracy, I've talked about the social market, policy pluralism, and the traits of realism independence, which I think are SDP traits. Today I'm going to try and get through 25 minutes without talking about Brexit, because I think we need a refresh from that, a little bit of a break from that. I will probably mention the word twice. What I want to do today is to talk about what the social is in our name, to look at the social part of the Social Democrats. What does it mean? And in particular, where is it convened? And I think it's convened in three things: the family, the community, and the nation. So I'll have a look at that, and then at the end I'll say a few words about our political opponents, and then a little bit about the outlook for the party. I will take questions, very happy to take questions if we have time at the end. So, the family, as fellow Social Democrat Michael Merrick has said, the family, not something the left's terribly good at talking about, the family. And they're in good company because the right, or certainly the people that call themselves conservatives, don't want to talk about it. And progressives don't want to talk about it, unless, of course, they're sneering at it or talking about it as patriarchal or oppressive in some way. And the close down of the debate on the family, the fact that we don't talk about it, I think is partly, as Rod has said many times, it's a debate that's closed down by people that don't want to debate. And when people close down debate, it's always for the same reason, because their arguments aren't very good, or the evidence isn't on their side. So let me just set out a few basic truths about the family. First, it's the fundamental social unit in all human societies. And to deny that would be to deny human history. It's also the place we first learn the virtues of obligation and compassion to others. It's critical to society, and in particular to create responsible adults. And in that, 3 cheers for marriage, because that provides a stable basis for family life. But the most profound thing about it, the profound thing about it, is that we are weaker alone. We are weaker without a family, and in particular a strong extended family, than if we have one. That's just a basic truth, I think. So if we looked at how's the British family doing, not so well, as it happens. There is a crisis in family life. More and more people are living alone. I think we've got 8 million households that are single households, single people. We marry later or not at all. Divorce rates have stabilised but are still pretty high. We're having fewer children, below the total fertility rates below replacement level. And the most telling thing is actually something that David Goodhart put in his book, which is that the average 16-year-old in Britain is more likely to have a screen in their room than a father in their house. And that's an astonishing statistic. So you've got to ask, does it matter? And of course it matters. And yet it's rare to hear politicians defend the family, and rarer still to hear them defend marriage. There's an odd cultural hostility, I think, and almost sort of instinctive distrust of the family among some quarters. And I think from some quarters it's a deliberate attack. Some progressives, I think, will spread the idea that fathers, for instance, are not really necessary. From the Conservatives, I think it's not deliberate. I think it's indifference. I think it's partly embarrassment, but it's partly indifference. And I want to talk about Conservative indifference later. It's absolutely key, a descriptor of them. So in the knife crime debate, which is a very important debate in our cities at the moment, the family will be rarely mentioned in political discourse on this. What is talked about is resources cuts, policing tactics, and I'm not saying they're not important. They obviously are important, but the question of the family is erased from the debate, and it doesn't seem to occur to the people that discuss it that lads without dads might be a little bit more vulnerable than would be the case if their father were present. Might be a little bit more likely to get into trouble. And yet it's not said, apart from a few exceptions. People like sane voices like Tony Sewell mention it, but very few people mention it. And as a result, the political debate on these things tends to be superficial and very short-term. What's actually preferred as an approach to society and everything else by both left and right, and it's this on combination, getting it from both ends, is the constant pursuit of self-interest, the freedom to do whatever we like. Self-realization is what it's all about, and you see that in politics, culture, advertising. You see it all over the place, and it's all very bohemian. Very bohemian. But not for the first time. Chesterton nailed it 100 years ago. Quote, "Modern broad-mindedness benefits the rich and benefits nobody else. It was meant to benefit the rich and meant to benefit nobody else." So the loss of strong extended families means that life for many people is just a little bit harder, a little bit lonelier, and a little bit less meaningful when family life was stronger. So what to do? Well, I think you'd be very naive to think that you could change massive sociological change overnight. Many of these things have been on 30, 40 years, I'd say, ever since the Bloomsbury Group were up to what they're up to. But they basically, you can't change it overnight. But you can do two things. We can do two things. We can stand up for the family and cultural discourse to try and change the cultural tone so it's a little bit less hostile, a little more friendly to the family. And we can do policy, which actively supports it. So in the policy round in January, we put up two things, well, three or four policies, but these are the key things. Couples raising children together should benefit from full sharing of tax allowances. And now that is, in the current cultural context, that is a very, very radical policy. It is, and it shouldn't be, but it is. It is. What would it mean? It would mean that parents would have more choice, an opportunity to bring their own kids up if they want. They don't necessarily have to outsource it, but they could if they wanted to. Second thing, housing policy. Build more houses. Build more council houses. Young people looking for houses to start a family or even a flat. In the southeast, it's a nightmare, absolute nightmare. And it's these practical things that we can do. So it'll take a long time, but you can certainly work on it. I'd like to finish this section on the family by, I'm going to read out a social media comment by a valued SDP member who can't be here today, but I know he's got a young family. And this is what he said on social media. Quote, "At the end of the day, the British dream, as it were, should, as a minimum, provide adequate income for folks to raise a family, to find a modest home, and adequate support for people to give their kids the time they need, especially in the early years." And I say hear to that. And if politics can't address that and deal with it, then we fail. So community, the second level, which I'd say where the social aspects of life are convened. I have a friend who bought a house a few years ago in a very, very quiet place. You can imagine you drive to a town, get through the town, end up at a village, drive through the village, end of the road, and you're there. Literally very few people there. But you know, he turned up to the solicitor's office to buy, to sign on the dotted line, and he asked a few questions, but he was committed to buying. He couldn't do anything about it. And he said, actually, just out of interest, has there been any crime in the area? And the solicitor looked a bit sheepish, and his clerk was there, and they were a bit quiet. And he said, yes, there has been some crime. Someone stole a ladder 30 years ago. We never found out who did it. And what you had, there's a lot in that story. There's the outrage at someone stealing a ladder. There's the fact that it was remembered for 30 years. And it was us, we didn't find out. It wasn't I, it was we, it was us. And what they're describing, actually, what that describes is community. And it's still to be found up and down the country in pockets, not universally, but in pockets. And it's where people know and trust each other, and where people participate, and they have an obligation to one another. And it's where civic society still exists. So if that's community, what is the opposite? Well, again, all too common in Britain. Places where trust is low and gates are high. Places where people don't know their neighbours, and they certainly don't engage with them very much. Where crime is high and state surveillance necessarily is high because of that. Places of loneliness and loss of connection. And I think British policy has reinforced this process. And I think there are lots of examples, but the example I like to use is The inner London council estates, actually a very good example of this. Quaker Court is a good example, built in the 50s, very, very close to the City of London. In the 50s and 60s, it was teeming with families. People knew each other. There was a reasonable expectation that the community would remain reasonably stable. Not so. Should we shout? Should we scream? What happened to the post-war dream? Well, it died. In places like Quaker Court, it's died. Today, it's a very, very transient place. Half of its flats and maisonettes are sold off. People literally don't know who their neighbour is, partly because the neighbour may be letting the place on Airbnb. You wouldn't know who was there. And it's a very, very transient place. And transience describes the problem, I think. Community takes time. You can't rush community. Familiarity takes time. It takes time for people to build trust and get to know each other. I don't know if any of you have read Dirk Bogart's memoirs, but they're partly fictional, of course, because they're memoirs, but they're very good in part. And he describes when he moved to France. He'd been there for quite a long time, and the lady in the post office never gave him the time of day, never spoke to him, largely, was very very cold, until she found out he was applying for French residency. And then it changed. Then she warmed up. And it changed because he showed commitment to the place. He wasn't a tourist at that stage. And they became very good friends, and that's community. So the question for policymakers then is what can you do about it? What can you do to strengthen community? Well, in the next policy round that we do, which is January, we're going to have a section specifically called Building Stable Communities. We can't go through it in detail, but what we want to attack in particular is one idea, and it's the assumption, and this is all over the place, the assumption that you have to get on, you have to get out. You have to leave your community, you have to leave your village or your town or your city or your region to get on. It's implicit. And again, this is everywhere. It's an assumption about how we do higher education, a lot of other things. And policy has driven this for about 30 or 40 years, and it's anti-communitarian. And that's got to change. We need to rebalance. And actually, a very good place to start is the great northern cities, like Leeds. So family, community. So the highest level is nation. We're describing the same thing, which is another community. Of all the sections of the New Declaration I enjoyed writing most, I think the bit that describes kicking against the progressive desire for people to shed their national identities. It's sort of a bit of John Gray getting in there. I enjoyed writing that the most because we need to challenge this project, and it is a project, to undermine the nation state, particularly in Europe. And we need to oppose those, basically, who disparage it, who misrepresent it, who largely ignore its value, who demonize those who defend it, and there's a lot of that going around. Go to any university now, modern university, and you'll see academics and undergraduates equate nationhood and the idea of nationality or belonging to racism. That's how bad it is. What they want is a world without borders. Borders somehow are an outrage, some sort of violation on our ability to go wherever we want, whenever we want. And the idea that you would put fellow citizens first, again, is very, very alien to them. And yet that's the fundamental that underpins a lot of what we do. In the real world, national self-determination matters because mutuality matters, national identity matters. It gives people real meaning in their lives. A point Maurice Glassman has made, I think correctly, he's absolutely right about this, is that the institutions like the NHS are fundamentally political achievements. It's a political achievement. It's a decision to convene the solidarity, to pay tax, to look after each other, and to make sure that the system delivers for all citizens, irrespective of the ability to pay. And what people that want to undermine nationhood don't grasp, what they don't get, sort of nation-hating idealists don't get, is that without community, you don't convene the solidarity. So without literally, something like the NHS is totally underpinned by the buy-in that you get in the nation. If you don't get the buy-in, you don't get the sharing. And if you don't get the sharing, you don't get the NHS. Key point to think about. What are they going to do when we're all Peter Singer universalists? How are they going to arrange that? And it is a pretense. It's interesting that in the EU, the pretend mutuality that you have across all these states is an utter lie. They say it, and in fact, two words refute it. The two words that will do economically are Greek crisis. That'll do it. That's enough. That shows. I mean, they say it, very good at saying it, but they don't really mean it. So there we are. As John Gray, I've mentioned him before, he's our finest political philosopher. He's rightly said that any project based on wanting the complete destruction of inherited identities, and nation-states are part of that, is a recipe for perpetual culture war. That's where we are. This is a terrible link, but talking of wars, Auburn War. Terrible. I apologise for that. Terrible, shocking. That happened by accident. Genuinely happened by accident. Auburn War said, and he was joking, of course, that anyone seeking election should be immediately disqualified. And it's very funny and everything. And he said that, we should be governed by a committee of Belgian ticket inspectors who would do their best, and use their best common sense and best endeavours to make decisions for us. It is amusing, but actually often life imitates art. And if you substitute the word ticket inspector for technocrat, that's pretty much in Europe. That's pretty much where we are. A lot of what goes on, and is decided, all the really, really big things, have been put deliberately beyond the reach of ordinary voters. And yet they wonder why people are alienated from politics. It's strange. Liberals fret about populism. They never ever see their role in creating it. It's curious. They don't see the link. We've had 30 or 40 years of double liberalism, and we've ended up with a populist reaction. And not for once can they see the link between the two. Puzzling. The cause of the reaction is double liberalism. It's social and economic liberalism simultaneously. And it's the combination of that plus a sort of hyper-globalism that's happened at the same time. And what's the result of that is that there's very, very little room for local choices. Again, it gets back to the community, some sort of community. The solution to this problem isn't a rampant populism. It's a decent reaction to it, which is a more communitarian, less individualistic politics. I'd call it a sort of softer, saner globalism that has greater respect for national differences. Countries have got to be able to build their own social contracts, and they've got to be able to make their own social and economic bargains. And they've got to be able to have the slack to do that, and at present they really don't. But I think if we go in that direction, actually we'll have a better world, a safer world, and a happier world. So those are the three things. I know I strayed onto Brexit a little, but those are basically the three things. So family, community, nation has become a social democratic strapline, and it has a lot of meaning. And as Rod has said many times before, the real divisions are between the people that believe in that and people that take a totally individualistic view of politics and society. And I think we're on the right side. So finally, our opponents. I'd like to say a few words about the Conservative Party, but obviously I can't because we don't have one, as we know. It literally doesn't exist. If it ever was conservative, but it hasn't been conservative for many, it hasn't conserved anything for many, many years. What we have is a sort of type of a value-free, pragmatic liberal party, and a socially liberal party, actually, that tries to give the market what it wants most of the time. And it's a price of everything and the value of nothing party. And I'll give you an example. So I get the train down to London a lot now. as you leave Newcastle Central Station, on your left, there is usually a locomotive, and it's got two big red letters, DB, Deutsche Bahn. It's the German national, it's the state railway. And they run our Tyne-Wear Metro, not particularly brilliantly. And they have a lot of other rail franchises. And the RMT Union estimate that about 70% of our rail network is run by foreign states, effectively. Now, that's happened, but I think it just represents utter indifference. And I think the people that put those policies forward, which are the Tories, represent that utter indifference. They literally don't care. They're not bothered. And yet, to me, as someone from the Northeast, that locomotive is literally, I mean, I can't throw very far, but you could almost throw a stone into Stephenson's boiler room where the first locomotives were made. You know, what is going on? Certainly no pride. It doesn't occur to the Conservatives that you could run a national railway system as an emblem of British engineering or organisational pride. It doesn't occur to them. It doesn't occur to them. And it's that special type of indifference that will lead to policy going in other directions, like giving the contract to build a nuclear power station at Hinkley Point to a police state. That's what they're thinking of doing. I mean, that actually isn't indifference. That's insane. That's crazy. 5G ditto. And I think there's a political opportunity here, and as Ed Miliband was saying, I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why. Because the public aren't indifferent. That's the reason. The public largely aren't indifferent, even if the people that govern them are. So I think they're completely on the wrong side of many things. I mean, Conservatives are a great company in the pub, and I like conservatism actually, but the Conservative Party is hopeless and it's irredeemable. So two more to do. The Labour Party. How do we do this? So, I think that if I invented something called a wrongometer that just measures how wrong you are about stuff. So let's imagine we've got a wrongometer or a rightometer. We just call it a wrongometer. Corbyn would be right at the top of the wrongometer. He's wrong about everything. I mean, I know there's some overlap with us, but he's wrong about literally everything. He's wrong in his sympathy for anti-Western causes. He's wrong that he can fool and con the British people on Brexit. In his fondness for identity politics. He's wrong in his indifference to anti-Semitism. He's wrong in his hard left economics. But at least he's consistent. He is consistent. But there's also wrongness to him being leader of the Labour Party that was led previously by Attlee and Gateskill. It's one of these things that shouldn't have happened. Corbyn also reminds me, there's a joke, the joke about the two sociologists. So there's two sociologists walking down the road, and they pass a ditch, and there's a man beaten and bloody lying in the ditch. And the sociologists walk on past, and one says to the other, you know, we've got to find the person that did this and help them. And that's being on the wrong side of every argument. So the Lib Dems, finally the Lib Dems. Well, as you know, we go a long way back with them. 17,410,742. That's, I think you know what that means. That's how many of us voted to leave the EU. 19,228. That's how many of us Social Democrats voted against the ridiculous merger with the Liberals and wanted to stay true with David Owen to what social democracy actually is. What that represents is the difference between social democracy and liberalism, totally different. We resisted it then, and I'm just so happy that we're resisting it now. And I look at the Lib Dems of today giving democracy the flick, and I just think, now do you see what it was all about? It was a terrible error, actually, to merge with those people, and I think history's borne us out. And I'll say this to Joe Swinson: sure, call yourself a liberal. Fine, you probably are, but don't dare call yourself a Democrat of any kind. So finally, I want to say a few words about the outlook of the party. This is going to be very general, but I've always said, at the risk of boring everyone, it will take time. Rebuilding this party will take time. And a year ago, we were in Glasgow, and it was a very small room. I think we had about 150 members nationally, and we've got over 10 times that, something like 10 times that now. What we've achieved, I think, in the last 12 months has been incredible. We published the new declaration to widespread acclaim. We had a massive turning point when Patrick joined us in November, and literally we haven't looked back since then. So thank you. Still. We produced our first comprehensive policy set for many years in January. Another huge boost when Rod joined us, got us into the thousands. Rod, thank you. We've contested our first national by-election since '93 in very, very difficult circumstances, I know, but it was right to do so. Our vote in the local elections of this year, the average vote we got was 7%, which is doubled from 3.5% the previous year. Wayne is getting closer and closer, the star candidate. If we have a single aim for next year, it's to get this man elected in this city. It must happen. And if anyone can help, just get in touch. You don't have to live in Leeds. Just get in touch. We'll find a way. Then in July, our very own Richard Plackett and Dr. George Cooper won a £25,000 prize in the IPPR Economics Prize, which is the third biggest economics prize in the world. And what an achievement. And the party received an equivalent donation. Very kind. Patrick and I have done quite a lot of media. Patrick's in London, so it's a bit easier for him. Northumberland's tricky, but we've been on the BBC and various podcasts, Talk Radio, LBC, and reported widely. We look forward to a general election. I think the basic aim is to get candidates in every region. We've also appointed our first-time national organiser, Lisa, who you'll hear from later. So would I have taken where we are now 12 months ago? I'd have bitten your hand off. And every single meeting you go to will get bigger and bigger. Finally, there is an importance to what we're doing, and it's this. No one else is doing it. Lots of think tanks, lots of academics we respect, lots of people sympathise with us, our basic view. But no one's doing the political project of building a party that contests elections and does the dirty work. We're doing it, and we're the only people doing it on this platform. And the good news is that over half the country believe in what we say. What our project is to occupy that space, to contest elections, and to give people a chance to vote for something they believe in, something valuable, and something better. And when I rejoined the SDP a few years ago, I did so primarily because when you looked out on the political landscape, there was something missing. It's not missing anymore. It's here. Thank you.